AWS S3 Concepts. Hey everybody, Ben Fingal here, and in this nugget, I want to take a look at some of the architecture and organization of S3 that makes it so easy to use. We'll start off with a high-level overview of exactly how S3 is organized, then we'll talk a little bit more in depth about buckets and objects, what exactly buckets and objects are, and how they relate to one another. Lastly, we'll finish up by taking a real brief look at some of the S3 security options. Security is always going to be a big deal inside of the cloud. Amazon S3 has a lot of really strong options for you to ensure that your data remains secure. Let's start at a high level and drill down slowly into Amazon S3 to understand the architecture or the organization of AWS S3. To begin with, at the top level, let's call this your account. Inside of your account in AWS, you've got your S3 service, and your S3 service can have one or more buckets underneath it. So those buckets have to belong to an account, and buckets have to exist before you can upload any data being called objects, into your Amazon S3 service. So here is a bucket that I've indicated has some objects in it. So buckets can have 0 or more objects inside of them. Objects cannot belong to the account, however, they belong inside of a bucket first. There's very loose, limited rules for these things. Your account can have up to 100 buckets, although that can be expanded with a service call to Amazon if you happen to need more than 100 buckets for any reason. And an individual bucket can have an unlimited number of objects inside of it. So there is no limit to the number of objects that you can have inside of a bucket. Buckets inside of S3 have very few rules or limits on them, but there's a couple of things that we do want to keep in mind. First of all, buckets are top-level containers. That means that they exist on the account level at the highest organization of the structure. Maybe buckets are best thought of or most analogous to a folder, a file folder, a directory on your computer. Right? You have to store files, you have to save files on your hard drive inside of directories, inside of folders. Well, same thing with S3. The buckets are the folders inside of S3. Buckets exist in a global namespace. This is really important because it's not a namespace that's unique to your S3 service or your account, but it's globally unique. So every bucket name, and you have to give your buckets a name, has to be globally unique. You can't use something obvious like my bucket because somewhere out there, somewhere in the world, someone already has my bucket. Your bucket name has to be completely unique. Now, buckets are created inside of a region, and recall from our infrastructure nuggets that a region is really just a collection of availability zones. So you have to indicate if you want your buckets to be created in the US West or the US East or Tokyo, whatever the case might be. You got to make sure that you choose a region for your buckets. Also, and this is really important, buckets cannot be nested. So I've already broken my file folder analogy. Yeah, file folders in your hard drive can be nested. Buckets cannot be, although in a minute I'll show you how you can kind of get around that. But you cannot have buckets inside of buckets. They are top level and single layer only. And then lastly, what's important to note is that when you're looking at your charges, they can be aggregated by buckets. So when you're understanding your usage and how S3 is accruing charges on your account, you can get reports and you can get usage charges at the bucket level. Now, Amazon S3 objects, on the other hand, go inside of the buckets like we talked about. And S3 objects are really the discrete files that you upload into S3. In fact, that's probably almost always the way that you are going to deal with objects inside of S3. You're going to be uploading and downloading files. You're going to be thinking of them as files. And they can be anywhere from, like we mentioned in a different nugget, 0 to 5 terabytes in size. So objects can be really, really large. Oh, and by the way, there's no limit to the number of objects that you can put inside of a bucket. So objects can be big. You can have an unlimited number of them. This is where the rubber really meets the road with S3. This is what you're going to like about using S3 for your cloud-based storage. Objects can also be versioned. This is an optional thing that you can turn on so you can have versioning for your objects. As you upload objects over each other, as you replace an object with maybe a newer copy of that particular object, you can enable versioning and get different versions of your objects stored up inside of Amazon S3. It's really the same as storing multiple copies of a file, uploading it 2 or 3 or 4 times. In terms of it takes up more space, it doesn't save you any space having versioning turned on. But it's a little bit simpler and it's managed for you by AWS. So if you think that you need versioning or backups, it's important to turn that on. Now this is really important. To get to an object, to download an object from Amazon S3, or frankly to upload one, the bucket plus the object key plus the optional version number that we just talked about maps to a unique URL. And this is what that URL looks like right here. The static part, the part of the URL that never changes no matter who's using the service, is s3amazonaws.com/. That is the domain name for the Amazon S3 service. But when you want to get to a file, you're going to include your bucket name in front of that as the header on that particular domain name. So here, in this case, I've indicated my bucket would be named bucket, although like I just mentioned, that bucket name is almost certainly not available. And then over here, you've got what's called the object key in green. So this green portion here is called the object key, and it looks, it just looks like a file name because that's more or less exactly what it is. Now, a few moments ago, I mentioned that buckets could not be nested, but you could kind of trick that. And one of the ways that you can trick that is that you can actually put a / into the object key, like I've indicated down here on this second example of the URL. So this still exists in the same bucket, the top level bucket named bucket inside of my S3 service. But now I've got an object whose file name is actually a / objectname.ext. And that creates the illusion of a file system. It looks like there's an object name inside of that structure, or it looks like there's rather a folder called A inside of that structure with a file named objectname.ext in it, when really that's just the whole name of the file. That is the entire name of the object. That is the object key. Now finally, one of the most important concepts that you're going to want to understand with AWS 3 is, that's right, security. If we're going to be uploading our data into the cloud, we want to know that it's secure. We want to know that everyone else can't get access to our AWS S3 data. And like we talk about in our shared security nuggets, in terms of other people getting access to data that's in your account, you don't have to worry about it. By default, your S3 is fairly secure and it's limited to people that are in your account. But when you want to get more fine-grained, granular control over who and what can access that data, S3 has those options for you. So one of the things that you can do is you can set up access control both at the bucket and at the object level. That means that you can grant permissions to an entire bucket so that everything that gets uploaded into that bucket is readable by, everybody. Maybe you want to set up anonymous access on that bucket so anyone can download files from that bucket. Or you can do it at an object by object level. You can set up individual objects to have their own permissions. And those permissions can be defined with something called ACLs, access control lists, where you simply list out users and the permissions that they have on that individual resource, the bucket or the object. We can also use the IAM, Identity and Access Management Policies, in order to create users inside of our AWS system that have specific permissions. And those permissions can be defined with both bucket and object policies using something called the access policy language. That's really just a JSON structured language for defining policies on our resources. We're going to cover all that IAM information inside of our security nuggets, so don't worry too much about it now. Just understand that there are two different ways. I call it the simple way with ACLs and the more robust or complex way with IAM policies. Also, and I mentioned this in a different nugget as well, you can encrypt your data in S3. And encrypting data is really, really important for a lot of regulatory standards that you may have to meet. So if you've got PCI data, if you've got HIPAA data, if you are controlled in any fashion by government regulatory agencies, you probably want to encrypt your data. And you can do two different ways. One, you can bring your own BYO encryption and simply encrypt your data before you send it. That's going to require that you manage your own encryption software and your encryption keys. That might be too big of a headache or a hassle for you. That's okay. AWS has encryption built into its streaming. If you simply include the right flag, the right header, inside of your REST call, you can store AES 256 encrypted data in S3 without any additional work. You simply want to indicate that you want your data encrypted, and it gets encrypted on the fly while it streams in. Amazon manages those keys in the Amazon Key Service, and then when you send it back, it decrypts it on the fly as well, assuming that the user downloading the data has permission to read it. Now, while this Essentials course does not get too in-depth into security, it's probably a big deal to you, and you should really expend some effort learning more about it, either by watching our other nuggets here at CBT Nuggets or spending some time with the AWS documentation. That concludes this nugget on AWS S3 Concepts. Just to recap, S3 is architected into buckets and objects. Buckets are like the file folders of your S3 service, and objects are the data or the files that you're uploading into those buckets. Your objects can be up to 5 terabytes in size, and you can have an unlimited number of them stored in Amazon S3. Securing this information comes at both the bucket and the object level as well, and you can use different features like ACLs or Identity and Access Management Policies in order to ensure that your data remains secure. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.